Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. We have a small announcement. Education is the most powerful weapon that we can all use to change the world. COVID 19 has become a major hurdle in this journey. It has prevented us from opening the wings of our imagination, equip ourselves with knowledge required for life, and to learn concepts to build our dreams and aspirations during this torrid period. To help you all overcome this crisis of COVID 19, we at Byju's are very happy to announce we have created a new YouTube channel for all the government exams. Aptitude, reasoning, data interpretation, videos, and much more will be released so that you can learn, unlearn, and relearn. Join our YouTube channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and extract maximum benefits from our new YouTube channel. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says the cost of haste. Any ethical issue in the society will have three dimensions to it. One is the institutional dimension, second is the societal dimension, and third is the individual dimension. What is the institutional dimension? This is nothing but establishment of an organization or an institution as a whole. The institution can be the government, or it can be an international organization or a corporate body which will enforce certain ethical dimensions in that particular society. So what is institution here? So what has been accepted as a social norm, when it is executed in a written form, enforced by the government, organization, or a corporate body, that is called as institutional dimension. Let me give you a simple example. Robbery is unethical. Murder is heinous in nature and is also unethical as well. But when the same is enforced by the source of law, which has an imprint of the government, that is what is called as institutional dimension. So the institutional dimension are nothing but the written form of ethics enforced by the government or the international body or the corporate body. This is an example of institutional dimension. Then what we have is the societal dimension. What are these societal dimension? These are nothing but unwritten societal norms and values shaped by the local environment within which the individual acts and conducts its business. Let's say, for example, what can be ethical in United States of America might not be ethical in India. These are not generalizations. I'm just giving you an example. It is generally believed that boozing, or what we can call as drinking of alcohol, might be okay in United States of America, but the same is not acceptable that easily in India. This is what is the societal dimension. Then what we have is the individual dimension to it. A person's values and beliefs which are influenced by the family, community, friends, local and national culture, religion, or any other type of geographical environment. So we are not considering the person's morals, but what we are considering is society influencing an individual, and that is what is called as individual ethics. This article here is speaking about the institutional dimension. We have the Drug Regulatory Authority. What does it do? It gives approvals for testing, and after proving the efficacy of that particular drug, it also grants permission so that this drug can be released in the market. This authority is generally believed to be risk averse. What do we mean by it? It means it does not want to take risk with the life of the people. This drug is a question of life and death of a person, and as a result, all due precautions are taken, and only when the tests are validated, scientifically proven, approval will be given by the Drug Regulatory Authority. But of late, we see a weird trend, and this weird trend is unfolding because of the COVID 19. The COVID 19 is killing people across all continents with no differentiation on the basis of country, religion, race, age, and status. In the present situation, we do not have any type of medicines or vaccines which can be used as a measure for the COVID 19. So what is happening? Companies are investing huge amount of money. One is to identify whether we can come up with a medicine or they can come up with a vaccine. So there are two objectives behind the company's motives. What are these two objectives? One is to save the life of a person. The other is to make as much profits as possible. In this particular backdrop, these companies are getting faster approval from the Drug Regulatory Authority. What was once a cautious, slow, but effective authority is now fast tracking the process. In this particular backdrop, the author voices certain concerns and also brings in certain ethical dimensions to it. What are the concerns voiced by the article? He says that under the present scenario, if there is an Indian company which has partnered with a foreign company, let's say a foreign company which is currently based in Russia. So if this particular company has come out with, let's assume there is a drug and it has conducted certain clinical trials as well, the same clinical trials can be given to India as well. So the new clinical trials need not be conducted in India, but the study which is based in Russia by the drug company can also be used in India, which is the major concern according to the author. The author also brings a critical concern as well. What is this? For drugs that have already proven to be safe for treating one disease may skip a fresh large human trial when it comes to COVID-19. Let me give you a simple example of itolizumab. Itolizumab is basically used for treating psoriasis. This particular drug has been used for COVID-19 as well. If it is safe for psoriasis, the same is being tested for COVID-19. So what is this particular drug has been explained on 19th of July 2020 under the second topic, psoriasis drug in COVID-19 therapy. So kindly look into it. So what the author says, when it comes to fast tracking by the drug regulatory authority, it has allowed certain companies directly to jump from stage 2 to stage 4 as it happened in itolizumab. There are other concerns where it has allowed companies to combine stages of trials. There are multiple stages of trials, 1, 2, 3 as well as 4. After each stage, the authority will have to test the clinical trials and only then give permission for entering into 2 and then into 3 and then into 4. In the present scenario, the same has not been considered by the Drug Authority of India. This ultimately means there are multiple ethical issues that this unfolds. What is the ethical dimension? Let's suppose there is a public health emergency. The world is witnessing this virus or the bacteria for the very first time. We do not have existing medicines. We do not have any types of vaccines for the disease that is currently present. So what does the government do? What does the community do? What does the World Health Organization do? In this particular case, what they do is they try the already existing medicines on the patients. So this gives rise to a question whether this is ethical or it is not ethical. Let's look at various arguments that whenever there has been such a public health emergency, is it right for the government to give permission for testing already existing medicines on the patient who have a new type of disease? Let's look at all the dimensions which say yes, it can be tested, and we will also look at arguments which say that they should not be tested. Vaccine trials typically are initiated on the humans only after they are conducted on the animals. It is first conducted on the animals, all the side effects and other things are looked into, and if it is able to prove immune and there are no side effects, only then it is conducted on the humans. So first it is conducted on the animals and then it is conducted on the human beings. So what is happening in the present scenario is because the COVID-19 is a pandemic, there is an exigency. This particular animal test is not being conducted at certain scenarios and the same is directly being applied to the human bodies. This will ultimately have certain repercussions. So what are these repercussions? Such medicines should not be implemented or cannot be tested on the human beings, as this is unethical is one such argument. Let's say there is a drug called as chloroquine or the hydroxychloroquine, which is not the drug that is manufactured for the COVID-19, but it is being tested for COVID-19. Initially the person may not have any of the effects, but eventually down the lane he may have certain side effects. It may also result in cardiac arrest as well. Even if he recovers from that particular medicine, there could be a possibility of side effects in the near future. So what is the unethical perspective? When there is a medicine that is being tested for COVID-19 which is not meant for it, there could be a possibility of side effects, and that is a violation of clinical trials is one such argument. The second argument is clinical trials is conducted because it has to prove the efficacy of this particular medicine. If clinical trials are not conducted, it does not go through a step by step procedure. This will ultimately harm them, and it can also snatch the life of a person. So whether there is pandemic, whether there is no pandemic, whether there is public emergency or there is no public emergency, one cannot actually move away from the established norms. So clinical trials are a must. So this is unethical is one such argument. Then what we also have to look at is, let's say there is a public emergency. During this public emergency, when there are no drugs that are existing, there are no vaccines that can actually kill that particular virus, what we can initiate is this particular drug on a new type of virus. This is also present in the medical ethics. According to medical ethics, when a doctor sees that there is a patient who is already suffering a lot, then in such a scenario, the existing drugs can be put up on the COVID-19 patient to see if this is going to work or not. This is what the medical ethics has also permitted. And at the same time, doctors have to be methodological as well. What do we mean by methodological? Let's suppose if we are giving hydroxychloroquine to a person suffering from COVID-19, a right dosage has to be given, and this person will have to be periodically checked. This dosage, is it right or wrong? Is it working for that person? What is the periodical test with respect to hydroxychloroquine? The same will have to be tabulated. A study has to be conducted, and in case it has proved to be ineffective, the same treatment will also have to be abandoned as well. So the medical ethics clearly says that it is ethical when there is a novel virus or a public emergency. So what is the way forward? So whenever there has been a pandemic like in Ebola in 2016, there has been a scenario where the existing drugs have been tested on a person. Another key point of concern is that whenever such drugs are being tested, what we also have to take is the consent of a person. If the consent of the person is taken, this will not have any ethical issues, as the person has himself given permission for testing this drug on that very person. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. So what we have done is that we have combined ethical issue along with health related issue in this very article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about Russia, India and China triangle. We have had an elaborate analysis of this topic on 23rd of June 2020 under the third topic, Jaishankar to attend India-China trilateral. The link for the same will be given in our description box. What are we going to discuss in this article? We will focus on all those aspects that which we have not discussed in our earlier sessions. India and China are witnessing bleak atmosphere in their relationship. China has violated established protocols and norms, entered areas which are under control of India, claiming that part as part of China, which has outrightly been rejected by India, and this tussle has led to death of about 20 Indian soldiers. While all this was happening, looking at it, many would have thought that India would not have attended the RIC virtual meeting which was held on 23rd of June. But as a surprise, India did attend this virtual meeting. After the meeting, the leaders issued their statements. What are these statements? The Chinese minister spoke about opposing bullying practices, rejected power politics, and about supporting role of international order in the international relations. What an irony from China. It speaks about not bullying, but it bullies all other countries. It speaks about international order, but does not represent the global order when it comes to the South China Sea. It asks about respecting each other's territorial integrity, but does not respect any of the country's territorial integrity, including that of India. And there were other statements also given by the Russian minister and the Indian minister as well. Russia's foreign minister criticized the United States of America's unilateral coercive measure to settle scores with geopolitical rivals as well as toppling the regimes. Then India's external minister also emphasized about durable world order, major powers respecting international law and recognizing the legitimate interests of the powers. These are the words as spoken by the ministers. In this particular backdrop, we will try and understand how was the RIC born, what was their original agenda, and what should be done in the near future as per this particular article. Initially, when it was formed, many had projected that this particular meeting of the three countries, Russia, India, and China, as anti West. It was also shown as anti USA as well, but when you look at it deep, as per the author, it is not anti West or anti USA, but it is with respect to non West principles, where this non West principles gave emphasis on the global order, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of all the global countries. The trilateral grouping, when it was initially formed, was particularly against the regime changes as enforced by United States of America. What do? They enter into a political country, they do not like the king or they may not like the government, and in the name of humanity and many other things, what do? They bring a new government or they replace an existing person with a new person. This has happened in Afghanistan, this has happened in Iraq, Syria, and Libya as well. So in Syria, they have been trying, but this is not working out that easily. So initially, when this RIC countries formed a trilateral grouping, they were against the regime change as initiated by the United States of America. So self-advancement motives should not disturb peace and tranquility in that region, as they disturb harmony and enable atrocities and crime, giving rise to fundamentalist ideologies like the ISIS as well as Al Qaeda. So, whenever you see an Al Qaeda coming up or an ISIS giving birth to, it is all because of regime changes, that which was initiated by another superpower called as United States of America. Apart from this, on the global level, you have number of economic organizations. Let's say for example, the Asian Development Bank, or let's say for example, the World Bank. In both these things, you have the United States of America or its allies like Japan, who have been heading this particular organization. They have massive power in all these organizations, and many other countries were not represented or they were underrepresented in these organizations, and as a result of which these three countries came up together and they started what is called as AIIB, and you have other countries as well, and then they also started what is called as BRIC, where Brazil was later added to this organization. So what they wanted was to democratize the whole economic architecture as that was prevalent in those times. So what was the whole idea? The whole idea was to make sure that regime change does not happen and they have a new economic architecture to balance the global order. Now the question is, after entering into this RIC, what did India accomplish? With respect to Russia, it was able to improve its political, defense and energy relationship as it was further strengthened. And with respect to China as well, they were encouraging signs to settle border dispute, that which was initiated in the year 2003, and in the year 2005 it simply recognized India's interest in the Arunachal Pradesh as well. But then came a small issue. What happened? India and United States of America's ties started boosting up. India had number of treaties with United States of America. It also wanted to diversify its resources with respect to defense equipments. So apart from Russia, where it was importing all its resources, it also started importing certain defense equipments from United States of America. And in the year 2008, what we also had was the nuclear civil deal as well. So all this meant that India was moving towards United States of America, and this was creating a drift between India and Russia, and also between India and China as well. What happens with respect to India and China? As United States of America became closer with India, what China thought, that it perceived that two greatest democracies are coming together and hatching a plot against China. And as a result, what does China do? China also comes up with a program of CPEC, violating the territorial integrity of India. So what China believes is that United States of America is plotting against China's hegemony. And at the same time, as India was getting closer and closer with United States of America, Russia also started tilting towards Pakistan as well. So what do? They embrace Pakistan. They also have military level talks as well. This is where India started diversifying once again, and it also started speaking to Russia so that Russia does not become closer to Pakistan. Having discussed about all these issues, the RIC trilateral meeting is very important for India. Let's take the example of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Through this particular organization, India would be able to reach the Central Asian countries. We have discussed this in our earlier videos as well. In fact, Central Asian countries have also welcomed the dilution of Russia and China's hegemony in case India does enter the SCO as well. As of now, there is dominance and hegemony imposed by Russia and China. With India coming into the picture, there would be balance. So the Central Asian countries are also welcoming this move. Disengagement is thus not an option when it comes to the RIC. We might have issues with China, but we should continue to have talks with this particular organization meeting, that is RIC. We have to work bilaterally, we have to work multilaterally, and we have to take a range of issues which we can actually discuss and negotiate and also come up with solutions, is what this article all about. But kindly remember, for the rest of the analysis, kindly look into 23rd June 2020, where we have discussed every dimension with respect to RIC. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says meeting China's intransigence with air power. This article here speaks about three viewpoints: China on world stage proving its military prowess, India's air force challenges, and it also speaks about possible options with India in case of increased tensions. First up, let us try and understand what is this China's military advances. China is a huge country. It is also a civilizational state. It has grown, developed, matured, created an empire of sorts, and proved its political and economic power repeatedly, and the world has acknowledged that as well. So when it comes to China, it has been able to prove to the world that they are a political power, they are also an economic power. Its relationship with the global community spreads across continents, with multiple countries on the political front, on the diplomatic front, engaging both on the bilateral level and also on the multilateral level. What we have to focus is on the historical development of China, a country which was initially based on its agricultural based economy, eventually turns into a manufacturing based economy. What was once having a closed set of economy is today kind of open to the economy, and it is today the world's manufacturing hub, exporting from the minute of tools and toys to the complicated gadgets. This ultimately means with the relationship that it has with all the countries, it is able to prove that it is a political powerhouse, and at the same time, because it is exporting all types of tools and mechanisms, it is also the economic powerhouse. This proves that China is here to stay, compete on the global scale, and that means it is going on a direct challenge with the United States of America. So what China has done with this, it has proved that it is a political power, it has proved that it is an economic power, but in order to prove that it is a hegemonic power, it also has to prove its military capabilities. But for a country to be called as military power, its dominance should be in 5 areas. What are these areas? Army, Navy, Air Force, technological, which also includes cyber warfare as well, and at the same time it also includes the space as well. Now let's compare United States of America with China. What does United States of America do in order to prove its military power? It goes and bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. It builds the NATO forces, goes on war far away from its soil in Korea and Vietnam, wages war in the name of humanity and in the name of democracy, where in Iraq, Libya, and also in Syria. What does it prove? It proves the military power of United States of America. It dominated the world because of its sheer investment in the domain of military. Now link this military power of United States of America with that of China. China has border issues with most of its neighbor. It also threatens countries of consequences in South China Sea. It also speaks about waging war with Japan. It also has issues with India as well. When it is going on such issues, what it is trying to prove is that it is a military power and it is ready to take on any country. So what United States of America did during the superpower era, the same is being replicated by China. So what is a political power, what is an economic power, is now trying to become a military power, is what the article trying to say on the very first priority. The next that we have to look at is it draws a comparison to India as well. What is the Indian comparison? As we discussed about China. India also has aspirations of its own. It also wants to become one of the superpowers, but the growth that India intends is totally different from how China intends to grow when it comes to the global order. Let's take the simple example of India. The MODs, that is the Ministry of Defense document of the annual report, define India's area of strategic interest as being from Persian Gulf in the west to the states of Malacca in the east, from the Central Asian Republic in the north to near the equator in the south. In 2012 and 13 version, it says India's size and strategic location links its security environment with the extended neighborhood, particularly with the neighboring countries and the regions of West, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Indian Ocean. The 2018 and 19 version mentions that India has deepened its relationship with a host of countries in almost all continents and those in Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean. All these studies and the reports prove to us that our growth story is totally different from that of China. India believes in the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We will grow, we want other countries to grow. We will blossom, we want other countries to blossom. It is not at the cost of other countries' growth, but China infects the local economy, destroys and makes them fall in debt trap, and one such example is Sri Lanka. So according to the author, India, aspiring to be one of the powerhouses in the world, has its own set of aspirations, has its own set of ambitions, which was misread by China. That is why we have the conflict in border. And at the same time, India did not assess the reaction of China, and that is where we failed, says the author. In this particular backdrop, the author also tries to bring in the importance of Air Force over the army. When it comes to army, they are huge in numbers. So whenever they have to be mobilized across the boundary, what we will require is a lot of time. So building the army and its mobilization will take a lot of time. And while we do this particular process, the enemies can also plot a scheme as well. So this particular scheme can also prevent the army from taking the strategic advantage. This is not the same with respect to the Air Force. The Air Force is agile. They are swift in nature. They can hit unknown areas of the enemies while they would still be preparing for it. So what we will have is a strategic advantage because of Air Force, which may not be provided by the army in the initial few days. Why? Because mobilization of the army will take a lot of time. But there is a problem with the Air Force. What is the Air Force problem? The problem is with the cost of the equipment. Since India does not have an indigenous Air Force jetcraft of its own, what we have to do is procure most of these from foreign countries. So this means it is a costly affair, and as a result, India will have to invest a lot of money when it comes to procuring jet aircraft from other countries. So India should be ready for it, because the last minute gamble will not work, and that is what happened in the 1999 war, Kargil war. So what the author suggests is that we have to make sure that we have enough number of jet aircraft so that we can take on the Chinese as well as the Pakistan at the same time. So investing on jet aircraft will become very important, as this will serve as a strategic advantage. In order to overcome this issue, what the author suggests is a three-step approach. What is this three-step approach? First is to prevent war at all costs if it is possible. What is the problems with war? What we will have is loss of lives. Soldiers' lives will be lost. Economic activities will be suspended. There will be drop in the economic growth. Investments will be reduced. Foreign companies will not invest in India, and as a result, what we will see is that the social program finances, which is present in education, which was put to health, will be diverted towards defense expenditure. So as a result, war should be prevented at all costs if it is possible. But in case we are not able to come up and stop this particular war, we have to go with give and take policy. This is at the cost of political cost. What do we mean by it? We have to go on a negotiation, we have to go on a consensus building with China, we have to give something and we have to take something with China. This is when we cannot stop war at any of the cost. And third is he speaks about preparation. So when it comes to preparation, he says that in case there is suspension of war, in case there are talks, they are suspended for some time, what we have to make sure is prepare for eventuality of war. So what we have to do is we have to build the capability, whether it is in cyber domain, technological domain, or the air force domain, build all types of relationship with close neighbors, United States of America or with Japan, and we have to make sure that we deter the opposition from committing a war against India. So these are the three approaches that he gives in order to prevent war or any kind of tussle or skirmishes with India. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the South Asian migrant crisis. It speaks about all those people who are leaving their native countries, going to another country. Why? Because it has opened economic opportunities for them. It speaks in general about India, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh and many other South Asian countries. It takes into consideration certain important statistics. South Asians account for nearly 15 million in Gulf. According to the World Bank, in 2019, total remittances to South Asia was about 140 billion, of which India received 83.1 billion, Pakistan received 22.5 billion, Bangladesh received 18.3 billion, and it also speaks about Nepal receiving about 8.1 billion. Now what we have to look at is that why is that these countries accept all these migrant workers from the South Asia to the Gulf countries. That is because the South Asian labor force forms the backbone of the Gulf countries. Why? They provide cheap labor. That is why they are allowed to enter the Gulf countries, and at the same time they also provide skilled workers as well. So these countries have dearth of skilled workers. It can be engineers, it can be doctors, it can be nurses, it can be other type of people who have their own management skills. All these people migrate to these countries because one, there are certain people who provide cheap labor and the skilled labor is comparatively less in all these countries. That's the reason they into migration. This is one part of the story. On the other part of the story is the concerns raised as these migrant workers step into the Gulf countries. There is one specific program called as the Kafala system, or what is called a sponsorship program. What is this Kafala system? Basically, this emerged during the 1950s. So what happens in this Kafala system? It is a relationship between the employer and the migrant worker. Let's suppose there is a migrant worker who is going to the Gulf country. So he will require permission from the employer. This permission given by the employer so that the worker from some other country can enter the Gulf country is what is called as kafala system. So a kafala system is an agreement between the employer and the migrant workers. One of the implicit objective of this kafala system is that during the boom period it will attract as many people as possible. Let's say the economy is doing good, the prices of the oil is really good. So during this particular period the employers will attract as many migrant workers as possible, and in case there is not a boom period, there is a slow growth in those particular period, then what it will also mean is that the migrant workers are pushed outside the system. So basically this is an agreement between employers and migrant workers where they will also ensure, as per the economy that is prevalent, countries will allow the people to step in, and if the economy is bad they'll ask the migrant workers to step outside the country and they have to vacate the premises of that country. How does this whole system work? Under the kafala system, a migrant worker's immigration status is legally bound to an employer as well as with the employee for a particular contract period. So what we call as kafala is nothing but a sponsorship, and this will have a contract between the employer and the migrant worker. The migrant worker cannot enter the country, transfer the employment, nor leave the country for any reason without first obtaining explicit written permission from this sponsoring scheme. So only when he's got the permission from the employer, only when he's got a particular contract, he would be able to enter the country, but he would not be able to transfer his job to another company or to a different employer. The worker must be sponsored by this particular employer in order to enter the destination country and remain tied to this kafil throughout their stay. But what are the major issues with respect to this kafala system? Let's suppose there is an employer who has asked the employee to work in the Gulf country, the minute he enters that particular country, his passport will be immediately confiscated. His travel document will be immediately confiscated, and he would not be able to leave the country in case there are any issues as well. This is in the contemporary form as equal to slavery as well. In case the migrant worker feel that he is not being paid enough, he has been going through a lot of emotional and psychological and physical torture, in case he happens to live without the travel documents, it will be treated as absconded, and this will be treated as an illegal act as well. That is the major issue with respect to the kafalas. Thus, in reality, what would happen is, because of this kafala system and also in general, these people would be paid very less. They are underpaid, they are arrested, they are detained, and ultimately deported from the country. They have no safety net, social security protection, welfare mechanisms, or even labor laws that are prevalent in that country. So what can be enforced for the local native people, the same may not be enforced for all these migrant workers. Now let's look at the COVID-19 issues. When it comes to the COVID-19 issues, the economies are really shattered. They are not working. Oil imports are not expanding, and as a result, the economy of the Gulf countries is really bad. When you look at this particular time, you have number of people from South Asia who enter into the zones of the Gulf countries. They are single men who happen to live in congested labor environments. Why? Because in case they are living in these congested labor, they would be able to save the money. The same money can also be remitted to their native countries. That is why, to save as much money as possible, they live in congested areas. But during COVID-19, the major issue is that in case there is a COVID-19 patient in this congested area, the same can spill over to many people, and this could be disastrous as well. So one is the issue of men living in the congested area, and at the same time, there are also issues with respect to the women domestic workers as well. As a result, many of the women domestic workers have lost their jobs because the economy is not going good. So because of both these issues, India has been asking all these people to come back, and at the same time, these people are also facing the economic issue, so they would want to come back to India as well. So what these issues basically show us is that whenever there has been an issue like in the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the global economic crisis, or the Nitakat law in Saudi Arabia, it is the native people from South Asia who suffer the most. What did the Indian government do? The Indian missions were completely inadequate. They did not have the administrative personnel, and as a result, they were not able to cater to the needs of all these migrant workers who were in the GCC countries. So the government was forced to ask these people to come back to India. So all those people who are willing to come back to India were asked to come back to India under the Vande Bharat mission. And after they are back, the most important factor is to give jobs for them, rehabilitate them, reintegrate them, and resettle them in their states. And the onus for this will become important. So the central government and the state government have taken number of precautionary steps and have also come up with schemes and programs to make sure that they are rehabilitated. So what is the way forward? As we have seen in the past, we have number of examples of Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, or the global economic crisis, or the Nitakat law issue in Saudi Arabia. All this meant that there will be people who will be coming back to India. So what we require is a comprehensive migration management system for people coming back to India in case of an economic crisis. So going forward, the government should not always take steps on the ad hoc basis, but it should have a plan in the near future such that in case there is a problem that unfolds, the government can take up all the precautionary measures. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into some of the preliminary practice questions. Which of the following are the classical dances of India? Bharatanatyam, Kathak dance, Garba, Kathakali, Gumar, Kuchipudi, and Odisha. The answer to this is 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7. Why? Because Guma and Garba are not the classical dances. Garba belongs to Gujarat and Guma belongs to Rajasthan. These are the folk dances of the state. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. So what are the classical dances of India? Bharatanatyam, Kathakali, Kathak, Manipuri, Odissi, Kuchipudi, Satriya, and Mohini Attam. Now let's look into the next practice question. One Vihar National Park is in the state of Madhya Pradesh. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. So kindly remember, One Vihar National Park is in Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh. It is situated right next to famous upper lake of Bhopal, also known as Bada Thalab, which is a Ramsar site and one of the two lakes of Boch wetland. It has unique distinction of being combination of national park, zoological garden, rescue center for wildlife, as well as conservation breeding center for vital species like tiger, Barasinga and vulture. Kindly remember, this One Vihar National Park is in the state of Madhya Pradesh. Now let's look into the next practice question. With respect to Valmiki National Park, which of the following statements is or incorrect? It is asking for the incorrect statement. It is located along the India-Nepal border in Bihar. This is right. It is on the bank of river Kosi. This is wrong. What is the incorrect answer? The incorrect answer is 2 only. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. So kindly remember, the Valmiki Nagar Tiger Reserve is located on the banks of Gandak River. It is not on river Kosi, but instead it is on Gandak. Consider the following statements about Pampa River. It originates at Pulachimalai Hill in Peramadu Plateau of Western Ghats. Pampa is the third longest river in Kerala after Periyar and Bharatapuzha. Sabarimala temple dedicated to Lord Ayappa is located on the banks of the river. Which of the above statements is correct? The answer to this is 1, 2 and 3. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. Consider the following statements. The Legislative Council of a state in India can be larger in size than half of the Legislative Assembly of that particular state. The governor of a state nominates the chairman of Legislative Council of that particular state. Which of the above statements are correct? The answer to this is neither 1 nor 2. Why? Because the maximum strength of the council is currently fixed at 1/3 of the total strength of the assembly, and the chairman is elected by the council from amongst its members. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Now let's look into the mains practice question. Is it ethical to use untested drugs during a public health emergency? Critically examine. What are the possible reasons for Chinese military expansion? Discuss the implications for India and the rest of the world. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review, come up with constructive criticism. This is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.